Crimean War, French Zouaves and Scottish Highlanders featured as a dynamic duo across a variety of media. Illustrated newspapers, theatrical performances, painting, photography, all relied on their accounts both on and off the battlefield. Analyzing representations of the Zouave and his Highlander sidekick demonstrates the extent to which soldiering in the 1850s was a performance. It was a costume and an identity that individuals could assume at will. The entire Crimean conflict had a certain exotic costume ball quality to it, and contemporaries were conscious of war as a spectacle produced for an audience's consumption. War was not always thus. David Bell, writing about the Napoleonic era, has explored the connections between Romanticism, war, and the novel. Battle, he argues, was a crucible out of which individual genius emerged. War was the turning point of Napoleon's personal Bildungsroman. It was the challenge that he vaulted over, knowing that he might instead fail tragically. His contemporaries similarly imagined the battlefield as the site where young men discovered their most authentic selves and tested their true capabilities. By the 1850s in the Crimea, however, the tropes of combat derived not from the novel, but from the vaudeville stage. As this image of the war's cast of characters from L'Illustration suggests, it was a pageant of costumes and ethnic types. In this theater of war, ordinary individuals could try on different roles, adopting costumes and personas across ethnic and gender lines. Instead of a romantic individual realizing his unique genius, the Zouave was an actor ready to change his, or sometimes her, costume, learn new lines, and appeal to a new public as necessary. Success required wit and artifice, not any deep-seated qualities of the heart. Zouaves brought the virtues of vaudeville actors to the theater of war. The test of battle revealed a Zouave's inventiveness and ability to rise to any occasion with cheeky self-assurance. The Crimean War has had very little purchase, either on the French imagination or on the French historical profession. Only a handful of Parisian place names outlasted Napoleon III, whose war they commemorate. In Britain, however, there has been a recent revival of scholarship on the Crimea, coming largely out of literary and art historical research. This work features the Crimea as the first war of the modern media. So Stephanie Markovits has analyzed the role of the mass press and the war correspondent in shaping the Crimea. The British government made little effort to control reporting from the war zone, and newspapermen seized on new technologies to highlight the immediacy of their stories. The Telegraph delivered those stories to the reading public with remarkable speed and with lithographic illustration. Correspondents enjoyed great freedom in their reporting, and they often contrasted British government's mismanagement of the war with alleged French military professionalism. A more heavily censored French press, in turn, happily reprinted this British coverage. French readers then enjoyed a similar sense of immediacy alongside a flattering impression of national competence. Art historian Ulrich Keller, writing a visual history of the Crimean War that focuses particularly on the illustrated press, observes that trying to probe beneath the picturesque surface of the war is an exercise in futility. Aesthetic factors enter the analysis at every point, until one realizes that the spectacular visual appeal of Crimean warfare forms one of its structural characteristics. These insights help us understand the Crimean episode in the career of the Zouave, an underappreciated but significant French contribution to the international military culture of the 19th century. The Crimea was the Zouave's first foray out of French North Africa, where the look originated in the 1830s with France's effort to garrison its new Algerian colony cheaply using native soldiers. The original experiment failed, and by the 1850s, the Zouaves were mostly Frenchmen, dressed in fanciful Arab garb. They were a hit from their very first appearance on the Crimean stage. Neither their questionable authenticity nor their elaborate dress called Zouave soldiering into question. William Howard Russell, who's often described as the first war correspondent, wrote in the Times that they were probably the most perfect soldiers in the world. Russell specified that he evaluated them with respect to all their military qualities and accomplishments, as well as to their dress and equipment, their powers of marching and endurance, everything, in short, that constitutes perfection in a soldier. Highlanders and Zouaves had a lot in common. They both fought in fanciful dress from the colonial periphery of the nation. Highlanders were the older of the pair. The first Black Watch Regiment formed shortly before 1745, and its soldiers received a special exemption on the ban on wearing Highland dress in 1747. Both uniforms involved a certain gender ambiguity. Scotsmen in skirts, Zouaves in trousers wide enough to be skirts. They also shared a primitive ferocity that belied the potential effeminacy of their dress. The friendship between these soldiers in exotic get-ups came to represent the end of Franco-British enmity and the ambitions of the imperial nation-state. We see the Zouave-Highlander pairing first in the Illustrated Press, where they both made for excellent copy. Aside from the geopolitical symbolism of their friendship, they shared a taste for drink. At least one grog shop in Gallipoli advertised its wares with a sign featuring a Zouave and a Highlander shaking hands and clinking glasses. The Zouave was a handy friend for a Highlander to claim, because the faux Arab Frenchmen never lacked for drink. They were exceptional figures, the Zouaves, and under any conditions, they could always find tasty food, intoxicating liquor, and the comforts of home. The most popular example of the hijinks of Zouave and Highlander appeared in multiple French and British papers. A Zouave and a Highlander got drunk together and traded uniforms. When the morning brought recollection, the Times recounted, the Highlander must have been rather horrified to find himself in a fez cap, a blue jacket embroidered with red worsted, a bright blue sash round his waist, and enormous scarlet pantaloons flapping about his legs. The fate of the Zouave, who woke up in a kilt and coatee, has not yet been ascertained. Maybe the Zouave was appalled to find himself wearing a skirt, but maybe not. The prominence of Zouaves and Highlanders in the Illustrated Press of the Crimea reminds us that Baudelaire's painter of modern life was Constantin Guy, a French artist who worked for the Illustrated London News in the Crimea. Baudelaire described soldiers alongside dandies, prostitutes, and fashionable ladies as quintessential figures of modernity who were accustomed to being looked at and conscious of their role in urban spectacle. Although Baudelaire had no love for the mass press, he recognized that Guy and his fellow commercial artists set out to capture what Baudelaire called the ephemeral, the fugitive, the contingent aspects of performance. Guy and Baudelaire recognized that the soldiers of their era were showmen, accustomed to parading in review and to being evaluated for their looks and their picturesque qualities. Zouave's Crimean fame and their appeal to war illustrators derived in no small part from their frontline theater. During the siege at Inkerman, Zouaves set up a stage and deployed their foraging skills to produce lavish costumes and sets. Making fun of foreigners was an element of most of their shows. The Russian enemy was, of course, the butt of many jokes. But their stolid British allies, who were often sitting in the audience, were funny too, like the soldier in one Zouave spectacle who knew only two French phrases, Bono Franzis and Donnez-moi du cognac, Johnny. Cross-dressing was the centerpiece of most Zouave performances. There were women present in the French camp. At Inkerman, the famous cantinière, you can see one in the left foreground of this image, taking money for tickets. The cantinière did not act, though. Zouave shows involved men in drag playing the female roles, and Zouaves revived popular Parisian plays whose plots turned on cross-dressing, such as the 1814 hit Les Anglaises pour rire, in which Frenchmen pose as English girls. In the spring of 1855, during the war, Zouave theater moved from the battlefield to the home front, and it took both Paris and London by storm. Among the first Zouave plays to reach Paris was the 1855 Pillebox et Friquet. Pillebox is a Highlander and Friquet a Zouave, and they're separated from their units behind enemy lines. The impassive Highlander and the more mercurial Zouave share biscuit and tobacco, and they squabble about who is to have the cantinière that they're both in love with. The cross-dressing tradition also moved from Inkerman to Europe. In Le Théâtre des Zouaves, which premiered in Paris in September 1855, the conflict is not only over who gets the girl, but also who gets to be the girl, as two Zouaves fight over who is to have the ingénue role in the play they are producing. At the climax of the play, Russian guns interrupt a rehearsal, and our two protagonists find themselves responding to the call to arms, despite being dressed in skirts and curled wigs. So Zouaves could be women, but women could also be Zouaves. Les Zouaves, un tableau militaire, a show that opened in Paris in the summer of 1856, had an all-female cast. Inevitably, perhaps, the cross-dressed Zouave found their way across the Channel and hooked up with the British pantomime tradition. The hit of the London holiday season of 1855 was Miss Mary Brown, in the costume of a Zouave, as you see her here, starring in a grand military ballet of Zouaves and British grenadiers. As these Zouave performances suggest, authenticity and the Zouave were strangers. Ethnic identity and sex were both up for grabs, and there was no authentic Zouave. Soldiering as a Zouave was a test of artifice, not of genuine, deeply rooted personal qualities. The Crimean War was the first conflict documented simultaneously by both painters and photographers. Art historians have written extensively about the coexistence of these media on the same battlefield, and they've focused primarily on assertions of authenticity. Photography clearly posed a serious challenge to painters' claim to represent war in an authentic fashion. Art historians have demonstrated the ways that painters sought to enhance the reality effects of their paintings, taking advantage of the limitations of photography that in the 1850s still required very static poses that subjects could hold for long exposure times. Painters like Horace Vernet produced large canvases in which the action threatens to spill out of the picture plane, as in the scene of Zouaves taking the Malakoff redoubt outside of Sebastopol. The paintings draw the viewer into the action. Photography, in contrast, could only capture the still aftermath of battle, as in James Robertson's image of a similar redoubt, now vacated by its Russian defenders. Here, however, I want to consider the question of authenticity from a slightly different direction by looking at the Zouave Highlander pair as they appeared in both paint and photography. The soldiers' costumed performance attracted artists in both media. Painters and photographers both used the conventional stylized performances of Zouave and Highlander as evidence of their art form's commitment to authenticity. We'll start with heroic battle painting, which enjoyed its last hurrah in the Crimea. In Eugène Lamy's painting of the Battle of the Alma, Zouave and Highlander stand in for national characteristics of the Allied states. The Highlanders on the left line up in parade order, the Zouaves, in contrast, mill about on the right. The Zouaves here represent spontaneity, and their gestures and their raised arms suggest their initiative and their approval of the orders they are about to carry out. Lamy uses Zouave and Highlander to refer to the new Anglo-French alliance, but the characters also give the painter a shorthand for referring to differences between the two nations. Horace Vernet's representation of the same scene is also an effort to capture the moment of battle as smoke rises in the rear and as troops move across the canvas to face the enemy. Zouave and Highlander appear together in this image, in the left foreground. They are departing arm in arm from the scene of battle, having performed their duty. Their differences remain in spite of their friendship. The Zouave, brandishing a Russian sword and wearing Russian medals that he has presumably just liberated, is the more dynamic member of the pair. The Highlander, wounded with his arm in a sling, is impassive and stiff. He marches off the field with his jaw set, looking directly ahead. When it came to Zouave and Highlander, photographers offered a very similar version of authentic reality. Roger Fenton, who's often described as the first war photographer, was fascinated with the exotic costumes of the Crimea, and he produced a series of orientalizing character studies of the conflict. Both the Zouaves and Highlanders feature in his Crimean catalog, although Scotsman struck Fenton as less glamorous than some of the other options he had available. Highlanders, as in this photograph, tend to show up in the rather stiffly posed portraits of officers that Fenton produced in camp. Zouaves, however, were a different matter, and in Fenton's Zouave photographs, we can see the full potential of the Zouave's trickster persona. This photograph of a Zouave and a Tzfahi, another fancy dress look from France's colonial army, suggests the North African's reputation for both ferocity and playfulness. The pose of the two exotically garbed men is relaxed, lounging even, but they could leap into action at any moment. Their worn uniforms and the crumbling plaster behind them deliver the authenticity that photography promised. These are real soldiers at the real front. The image offered its viewers, who included Queen Victoria and the Emperor Napoleon III, both of whom purchased Fenton's album, it offered them an insider's view of soldiering in distant lands. The authenticity of a Zouave, however, was never beyond question, and a real Zouave could be many things. Witness the multiple studio portraits Fenton took of himself, dressed as a Zouave, that he exhibited alongside his Crimean photographs. He probably took this portrait in London, but his Zouave performance is spot on. The rough drape and the ragged furs that cover the floor and the seat suggest an improvised military camp. The full beard, the lounging pose, the spread legs contrast with the erect rifle held between them and with his intense gaze. I'd like to conclude with one final Crimean-inspired example of Zouave performance. This charming small canvas by the battlefield painter Adolphe Yvon, where we see the 4-year-old Prince Imperial hosting a party for sons of soldiers. They're not much bigger than the drum, but the grown-ups encourage them in their Zouave performance. Napoleon and Eugénie, recognizing that the emperor was unlikely to live until his son reached adulthood, cultivated the boy's connection with the army and especially with its Zouave units. Zouave dress, this painting suggests, was suitable for little boys whose military exploits were still in the distant future. These child Zouaves caught on internationally as well. On the left, we see our Zouave and Highlander pairing again, Only this time, the Zouave is a little English boy on a seaside excursion, and the Highlander is his elder sister, decked out in tartan. The roles could be reversed, however, as we see on the right, an account of a children's party hosted by the British legation in Honolulu. The King of Hawaii had just created his own unit of Zouaves in 1864, when Master James Robertson attended the party as a Highland laddie alongside his sister, Miss Florence, dressed as a young Zouave. Little girls didn't have to wait to grow up to be Zouaves either. These visual representations of the Crimea and its soldiers suggest that the spectacular and theatrical tropes that produced the Zouave and his Highlander pal established themselves so thoroughly that they became the basis for pictorial realism while simultaneously offering a repertoire of images and ideas for fantasy performance. Fenton's photographs, the battle canvases, the stage productions, and the newspaper coverage combined to make the Crimea a breakout moment for the Zouave, who would go on to worldwide fame in the 1860s. A wide range of armies adopted the look, both sides of the US Civil War, Pope Pius IX, and Queen Victoria, among others, outfitted soldiers as Zouaves in the 1860s. This expansion of Zouave territory relied on the notion that the Zouave was an identity available to a wide variety of actors, men, women, children, but also Catholics, Confederates, and Jamaicans, and so on, could all be Zouave. This coupling of soldiering and vaudeville was crucial to the international success of the Zouave uniform. And thank you very much.